1903 studio portrait recovered, and historians whisper when they enlarge the figure in the mirror. The archive room of the Providence Historical Society smelled of old paper and dust, a scent Dr. Rebecca Hayes had grown to love over her 15 years as head archivist. She carefully lifted the lid of a donation box that had arrived that morning, labeled simply, "Estate Sale, Wickenden Street." Inside, beneath layers of yellowed newspapers and forgotten documents, her fingers brushed against something solid wrapped in brown cloth. Rebecca unwrapped it slowly, revealing a wooden frame containing a sepia-toned photograph. Her breath caught. The image showed a family of 6 posed in what appeared to be a professional photography studio. The father stood rigid and stern, one hand on his wife's shoulder. The mother sat primadmost, her expression unreadable, surrounded by 4 children arranged by height. The youngest, a boy of perhaps 5, clutched a wooden toy horse. The photograph was remarkably well preserved for its age. Rebecca turned it over carefully. On the back, written in faded ink, "The Donovan Family, Whitmore Photography Studio, March 14, 1903. She returned to her desk and placed the photograph under her magnifying lamp. The details were extraordinary. She could see the texture of the father's wool suit, the delicate lace on the mother's collar, even the individual buttons on the children's clothing. Behind the family, the studio's backdrop showed painted columns and draped fabric, typical of the era. To the left stood an ornate full-length mirror with an elaborate gilded frame. Rebecca's eyes moved across the image methodically, cataloging every detail for the archive database. Then she paused. Something in the mirror's reflection seemed off. She leaned closer, adjusting the lamp's angle. The mirror reflected the backs of the family members, exactly as it should. But there was something else. A shape. A figure. Rebecca reached for her digital scanner, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, she had the image on her computer screen. She zoomed in on the mirror's reflection, enhancing the resolution. Her coffee grew cold as she stared at the screen, her mind racing through logical explanations. What she saw made no sense. In the mirror's reflection, clearly visible behind the posed family, stood a small figure. A child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, facing the camera directly. A child who did not appear anywhere else in the photograph. Rebecca spent the rest of that afternoon examining the photograph from every angle. She checked for signs of double exposure, a common photographic error in 1903 when cameras required long exposure times. Nothing. She looked for evidence of tampering or manipulation. The photograph showed no signs of alteration. The emulsion was intact, the paper consistent throughout. She pulled out her reference books on early 20th century photography techniques. Glass plate negatives were standard in 1903, and the Whitmore Photography Studio would have used them. Such negatives occasionally captured unintended images, but they would appear ghostly, translucent. This child in the mirror was solid, detailed, unmistakable. Rebecca photographed the image from multiple angles under different lighting conditions. Each time, the result was the same. 6 people posed for the camera, 7 reflected in the mirror. By evening, she had created a detailed analysis document. The child in the mirror appeared to be a girl, judging by the length of her hair and the style of her dress. She stood slightly to the left of the family group, her face turned toward the camera. Unlike the posed family members, this child's expression was different, haunted, almost pleading. Rebecca printed out an enlarged section of the mirror's reflection and pinned it to her research board. She began searching the Historical Society's database for information about the Donovan family. The search returned nothing. She expanded her query to include city directories from 1900 to 1905. There, James Donovan, listed as a shipping clerk residing at 47 Benefit Street in 1902 and 1903. Rebecca's pulse quickened. She cross-referenced the address with property records and found that the house still stood, now converted into apartments. The 1904 directory showed the address as vacant. No forwarding information, no death records. The Donovan family had simply vanished. She returned to the photograph, studying each family member's face. The father's stern expression now seemed different to her. Not proud, but strained. The mother's hands, clasped in her lap, were white-knuckled, tense. The children's eyes, which she had initially read as obedient and still, now appeared frightened. Rebecca glanced at the clock. 8:30. She should go home, but something about this photograph held her. She made fresh coffee and settled back at her desk, determined to find out who the Donovans were and what had happened to them, and most importantly, who was the child in the mirror. The next morning, Rebecca arrived at the archives before dawn. She had barely slept, her mind churning with questions about the Donovan photograph. Her first task was to locate information about the Whitmore Photography Studio. The Providence business directories from 1900 to 1910 were stored in the climate-controlled vault. Rebecca found the volumes and carried them to her desk. She traced her finger down the listings until she found it. Whitmore Photography Studio, Portraits and Commemorative Photography, 128 Westminster Street. Proprietor, Ambrose Whitmore. The studio had operated from 1898 to 1903. After that, nothing. No forwarding address, no sale announcement, no obituary for Ambrose Whitmore. Another disappearance. Rebecca searched the newspaper archives next, loading microfilm reels onto the reader. The Providence Journal from March 1903 revealed nothing about the Donovans or the studio. She moved forward week by week, her eyes straining in the reader's dim light. Then, in the April 2, 1903 edition, she found a small notice buried on page 7. Whitmore Photography Studio, closed until further notice. That was all. No explanation, no details. Rebecca continued searching through April and May. On May 18th, she found something more substantial. A brief article reported that the building at 128 Westminster Street had been sold to new owners who planned to convert it into office space. The article mentioned that the previous tenant, Mr. Ambrose Whitmore, had departed Providence for reasons unknown, leaving behind equipment and furnishings. She sat back, processing this information. The timeline was becoming clearer. The Donovan family portrait was taken on March 14th. Less than 3 weeks later, the studio closed abruptly. By mid-May, Whitmore was gone. Rebecca decided to visit 128 Westminster Street. The building might offer clues that documents could not. The walk from the Historical Society took 15 minutes. Westminster Street had changed dramatically since 1903, but some of the older buildings remained. Number 128 was a narrow, 3-story brick structure, wedged between modern storefronts. The ground floor now housed a coffee shop. Rebecca entered and approached the counter. A young man with tattooed forearms looked up from the espresso machine. "Can I help you?" "I'm researching the history of this building," Rebecca said. "Do you know if there's access to the upper floors?" "Storage, mostly. The owner sometimes rents it out." "Why?" Rebecca showed him a copy of the photograph on her tablet. "This was taken here in 1903, when this was a photography studio." The young man studied the image, his expression shifting from casual interest to something more intent. He zoomed in on the mirror. "Is that... There's an extra kid in the reflection." "Yes," Rebecca said quietly. "That's what I'm trying to understand." The coffee shop owner, whose name was Kevin, made a phone call. 20 minutes later, an elderly woman arrived carrying a ring of old keys. She introduced herself as Mrs. Petrova, the building's owner. "Kevin said you're interested in the history upstairs," she said, her accent marking her as a first-generation immigrant. "I bought this building in 1987. Never done much with the upper floors except storage." Rebecca explained her research, showing Mrs. Petrova the photograph. The older woman's eyes widened as she examined the mirror's reflection. "This is very strange," she murmured. "Come, I show you." They climbed a narrow staircase behind the coffee shop's storage room. The second floor was dusty and dim, filled with boxes and old furniture. But the space retained its original layout. Rebecca could see where walls had once divided the open area into rooms. "The studio would have been here," Mrs. Petrova said, gesturing to the front section where tall windows faced Westminster Street. "When I bought building, there was still old equipment. I sold most of it, but some things I kept. Come." She led Rebecca to a corner where a canvas tarp covered a large object. Mrs. Petrova pulled it aside, revealing an ornate full-length mirror in a gilded frame. Rebecca's heart hammered. It was the same mirror from the photograph. "This was here when you bought the building?" Rebecca asked, moving closer. "Yes. Too heavy to move, too beautiful to throw away. So I cover it. Leave it here." Rebecca examined the mirror carefully. The glass was old, slightly warped with age, the silvering degraded in spots. The frame's gilding had worn away in places, revealing dark wood beneath. She pulled out her tablet and compared the mirror to the one in the photograph. They were identical. Every scroll, every decorative element matched perfectly. She stood where the photographer would have stood in 1903, positioning her tablet to replicate the camera's angle. From this spot, the mirror would have reflected whoever stood behind the camera, just as it reflected the unknown child in the Donovan portrait. "Mrs. Petrova, when you bought this building, did you find any other items from the photography studio? Records, photographs, equipment?" "Some boxes. I put them in basement. Never looked through them. Just old papers, I thought." Rebecca's pulse quickened. "May I see them?" The basement was accessed through an exterior door at the building's rear. Concrete steps descended into darkness. Mrs. Petrova found a light switch, illuminating a low-ceilinged space filled with decades of accumulated storage. "Back there," she said, pointing to a corner. "The boxes with black writing." Rebecca found 3 wooden crates marked Whitmore in faded paint. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the first one. Inside were glass plate negatives, hundreds of them, carefully wrapped in old newspapers. Rebecca transported the 3 crates to the Historical Society with Mrs. Petrova's permission, promising to catalog everything and return items the owner wanted to keep. She spent the entire afternoon carefully unwrapping glass plate negatives, wearing cotton gloves to protect the fragile materials. Each plate was a window into Providence's past. She saw families posed stiffly in their finest clothes, young couples on their wedding day, children clutching toys and pets, elderly people with faces carved by hard lives. Most plates were labeled with dates and names written in careful script on paper sleeves. She worked methodically, organizing plates by date. The earliest were from 1898, the latest from March 1903. She found no plates dated after March 20th, supporting the timeline of the studio's abrupt closure. As evening approached, Rebecca reached the bottom of the second crate. Her breath caught. There, wrapped in brown paper, was a glass plate labeled Donovan Family, March 14, 1903. She carried it to her light table with extreme care, her hands steady despite her racing heart. Glass plate negatives required careful viewing. The image appeared reversed, dark where the final print would be light. But even in negative, she could see the family clearly. And in the mirror's reflection, she could see the child. Rebecca scanned the plate at the highest resolution her equipment allowed, then inverted the digital image to create a positive. On her computer screen, the Donovan family appeared exactly as they did in the photograph she had found. But now, she could examine every detail of the original negative. She zoomed in on the mirror's reflection, enhancing the image carefully. The child's features became clearer. A girl, perhaps 8 years old, with long dark hair and a pale dress. Her expression was unmistakable now, not just haunted, but terrified. Rebecca continued searching through the remaining plates. Near the bottom of the third crate, she found something that made her freeze. Another glass plate, unlabeled, showing the same studio setup, but without any subjects. Just the empty room, the backdrop, the props, and the mirror. In this plate, the mirror reflected something she hadn't expected to see. Standing exactly where the unknown child had stood in the Donovan portrait was a chair, a small wooden chair, the kind used to seat children for portraits. Someone had deliberately removed that chair before photographing the Donovan family. But the child's reflection remained. Rebecca sat back, her mind working through possibilities. Could this be a double exposure, the ghost of a previous photograph bleeding through? But glass plates didn't work that way. Each plate captured only what was before the camera at the moment of exposure. She needed to find out more about the Donovan children. If there had been a 5th child, one who died or disappeared before the portrait was taken, that might explain why the family left Providence so abruptly. The Providence City Clerk's office opened at 8. Rebecca was waiting outside at 7:45, a notebook and copies of the photograph in her bag. She had called ahead, explaining her research, and a clerk named Patricia had agreed to help her search birth and death records from the early 1900s. Patricia was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain and an evident passion for local history. She led Rebecca to a room lined with enormous leather-bound volumes. "Birth records first," Patricia said, pulling down a volume marked 1890-1895. "You said the children in the photo appeared to range from about 5 to 14? "Approximately. The family portrait was taken in March 1903. They worked backwards through the records. Rebecca found the first match quickly. Thomas Donovan, born April 3, 1897, to James and Catherine Donovan of Benefit Street. Then Margaret Donovan, born September 1895. William Donovan, born January 1894. And finally, Eleanor Donovan, born March 1889. 4 children. The same 4 who appeared in the photograph. "No 5th child," Rebecca murmured, writing down the information. "Let me check death records," Patricia said. "Sometimes families lost children in infancy or early childhood. If there was another Donovan child who died young, there would be a record." They searched through death records from 1889 to 1903. No deceased Donovan children. Rebecca felt both relieved and frustrated. The existence of a dead child would have provided an explanation, however tragic. Instead, the mystery deepened. "What about the parents?" Rebecca asked. "Can we find marriage records, death records for James and Catherine Donovan?" Patricia pulled down more volumes. They found the marriage record easily. James Donovan and Catherine Murphy, married October 15, 1888 at St. Mary's Church. But there were no death records for either parent in Providence. "They must have left the city," Patricia said. "People moved around a lot back then, especially working-class families. Economic opportunities, family troubles, health issues, lots of reasons to relocate. But to leave no forwarding address, no trace in any records, The whole family just disappeared. Patricia's expression grew thoughtful. Let me check something else. She disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a different type of ledger. These are immigration records maintained by the city. Many immigrant families had their movements tracked, especially if they were considered transient or if there were concerns about public welfare. She opened the ledger, running her finger down columns of names. Here, Donovan, James. Irish immigrant, arrived Boston 1882, relocated to Providence 1885. Employed as shipping clerk at... She paused, her finger stopping on a particular entry. What is it? Rebecca asked. There's a notation here from April 1903. It says the family was relocated under municipal welfare provision to undisclosed location following incident of March 1903. Rebecca stared at the notation in the immigration ledger. Incident of March 1903. What kind of incident? Patricia shook her head. These records don't specify, but the phrase relocated under municipal welfare provision suggests official involvement. The city may have moved them for their own protection or because of some scandal. Where would I find more information about municipal welfare actions? Those records would have been kept by the Department of Public Welfare, but most files from that era were destroyed in the 1938 hurricane. Water damage wiped out entire archives. Patricia paused, considering. But there might be something in the police records. If the incident involved law enforcement, there would be a report. The Providence Police Department's historical archives were housed in a basement storage facility on Broad Street. Rebecca arrived just before noon, armed with the information from the city clerk's office. The archivist, a retired officer named Frank Morrison, listened to her request with growing interest. March 1903, Donovan family, Benefit Street, he repeated, typing into an old computer. Let me see what we've got. He disappeared into the stacks and returned 20 minutes later carrying a brown accordion folder tied with string. Found it. But I have to warn you, this file was marked sensitive when it was archived. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she untied the string. Inside were handwritten police reports on yellowed paper, some barely legible. She arranged them chronologically. The first report was dated March 28, 1903, 2 weeks after the Donovan family portrait. Officer Patrick Riley had responded to a complaint from neighbors at 47 Benefit Street about disturbing sounds and possible domestic disturbance. Rebecca read aloud. Upon arrival at approximately 9 p.m., this officer found the Donovan residence in a state of disarray. Mrs. Catherine Donovan was in an extremely agitated state, claiming that her daughter had been taken. When asked to clarify, Mrs. Donovan became incoherent, alternating between claims that her daughter was missing and statements that she never had more than 4 children. Mr. James Donovan appeared equally distressed but unable to provide coherent information. The next report, dated March 29th, continued the account. Follow-up investigation revealed no evidence of a missing child. Neighbors confirmed that the Donovan family consisted of parents and 4 children. No additional child had been seen at the residence. Mrs. Donovan was examined by Dr. Samuel Hartley, who diagnosed her with acute nervous exhaustion and possible hysteria, recommended treatment and rest. A report from March 30th noted, Mrs. Donovan continues to insist that she had 5 children and that 1 daughter has disappeared. She produced a photograph taken at Whitmore Photography Studio showing the family, claiming that proof of her 5th child could be seen in the image. This officer examined the photograph but observed only the 4 known children. Rebecca sat back, her mind racing. Catherine Donovan had known. She had seen the child in the mirror. Frank Morrison leaned over Rebecca's shoulder, reading the reports with her. This is strange stuff, he said quietly. A mother insisting she had 5 children when everyone else remembers 4? Rebecca continued reading through the file. An April 2nd report stated, at the request of the Department of Public Welfare, the Donovan family has been relocated to an institution for rest and treatment. Children placed in temporary care at St. Vincent's Home for Children. Case considered resolved. St. Vincent's Home for Children, Rebecca repeated. Does that still exist? Closed in the 1970s, Frank said, but their records were transferred to Catholic Charities. They might have information about the Donovan children. The final document in the police file made Rebecca's blood run cold. It was a brief note from the police chief to the investigating officers, dated April 5, 1903. The Donovan matter is to be considered closed. No further investigation warranted. All reports to be filed as resolved. Any inquiries to be directed to this office, by order of the mayor. Someone wanted this buried, Rebecca said. Looks like it, Frank agreed. But why? A family having some kind of breakdown isn't unusual, especially not back then. Why would the mayor's office get involved? Rebecca photographed every page in the file, thanking Frank for his help. As she left the police archives, she called Catholic Charities and arranged to visit their records department the following morning. That evening, back in her apartment, Rebecca spread out everything she had gathered. The photograph, the glass plate negative, birth records, immigration records, police reports. She created a timeline on her wall, connecting events with string. March 14, 1903, Donovan family portrait taken at Whitmore Photography Studio. Unknown child visible in mirror reflection. March 28, 1903, police called to Donovan residence. Catherine Donovan claims her daughter has disappeared, though neighbors confirm only 4 children ever lived there. April 2, 1903, Whitmore Photography Studio closes abruptly. Ambrose Whitmore leaves Providence. April 2, 1903, Donovan family relocated by city officials. Children placed in St. Vincent's home. April 5, 1903, police chief orders case closed by mayoral directive. Rebecca stared at the timeline. There was a pattern here, a sequence of events that suggested something more than a mother's breakdown. But what? She turned her attention back to the photograph, examining each family member's face. The father, stern and strained. The mother, tense and frightened. And the children. She looked at them more carefully now. Eleanor, the oldest at 14, stood slightly apart from her siblings, her expression blank. William, 12, had his hand on his younger sister Margaret's shoulder, protective, almost possessive. Margaret, 8, stared directly at the camera with unusual intensity. And little Thomas, just 5, clutched his toy horse as if it were the only solid thing in an uncertain world. Then Rebecca noticed something she had missed before. Margaret's dress. It was identical to the dress worn by the child in the mirror. The Catholic Charities records room was housed in a former convent in the Smith Hill neighborhood. Rebecca met with Sister Maria, an elderly nun who had worked with the organization for over 50 years and served as their unofficial historian. The St. Vincent's records are quite comprehensive, Sister Maria said, leading Rebecca through rows of filing cabinets. The sisters who ran the home were meticulous record keepers. What years are you researching? 1903, specifically April. I'm looking for information about 4 children from the Donovan family who were placed there temporarily. Sister Maria pulled out a drawer and extracted a ledger. Here we are, April 1903. She ran her finger down the entries. Yes, the Donovan children. Eleanor, William, Margaret, and Thomas. Admitted April 3rd. How long did they stay? Sister Maria turned pages, following the children's records. They were there for 6 weeks. Released June 15th to the custody of their maternal uncle, Patrick Murphy, who relocated them to... She squinted at the faded writing. Boston, Massachusetts. What about the parents, James and Catherine Donovan? Let me check the associated notes. Sister Maria pulled out a folder of correspondence. Here's a letter from the Department of Public Welfare. It states that Mr. and Mrs. Donovan were undergoing treatment at Butler Hospital for nervous disorders and would be reunited with their children once their health improved. Butler Hospital was Providence's psychiatric institution. Rebecca made a note to visit their archives next. Sister Maria, are there any notes about the children's behavior while they were at St. Vincent's? Any observations from the sisters who cared for them? The nun found a daily logbook and opened it to April 1903. The sisters did keep detailed notes. Let's see. Eleanor Donovan, age 14, described as withdrawn and refusing to speak about family circumstances. William, age 12, protective of younger siblings, especially Margaret. Thomas, age 5, suffering nightmares, calling out for his sister. His sister Margaret? No, that's the odd thing. Sister Maria read the note more carefully. It says he was calling out for my other sister. When the sisters asked him about this, he said he couldn't remember her name, only that she was gone. Rebecca felt a chill. What about Margaret herself? Any notes about her? Sister Maria scanned the pages, then stopped. This is unusual. Margaret Donovan, age 8, was described as deeply troubled, claims to see and speak with a sister who does not exist. The sisters initially thought she was confused, perhaps creating an imaginary companion to cope with the separation from her parents. But then, Sister Maria's voice trailed off as she read further. Then what? Then something happened that frightened the sisters. On April 20th, one of the nuns found Margaret in the chapel, speaking to someone the nun could not see. When questioned, Margaret said she was talking to her sister who lives in mirrors. Rebecca spent the next week gathering the final pieces of the puzzle. At Butler Hospital's archives, she found admission records for James and Catherine Donovan. Both had been committed on April 3, 1903, diagnosed with shared delusional disorder. The records noted that both patients insisted they had 5 children, not 4, and that their daughter had disappeared into a mirror. They were released in September 1903 and moved to Boston to rejoin their children. James Donovan died in 1918 during the influenza epidemic. Catherine lived until 1941. Neither ever returned to Providence. Rebecca tracked down descendants through genealogical records. She found a great-granddaughter of William Donovan living in Portland, Maine, a woman named Helen who was in her 70s and had inherited family documents. They met at a coffee shop in Portland on a gray November afternoon. Helen brought a small wooden box containing letters, photographs, and a diary. "My grandfather William never talked much about his childhood in Providence," Helen said. "But before he died, he gave me this box and told me that someday someone would come asking questions. He said when that happened, I should tell them the truth." Rebecca opened the diary. It had belonged to Eleanor Donovan, the oldest child. The entries from March 1903 were brief but revealing. March 14th. Today we went to the photography studio. Mama insisted we all dress in our best clothes. She said we needed a portrait of the whole family, all 6 of us together. But there are only 6 of us if you count Margaret twice. The Margaret we can touch, and the Margaret in the mirrors. I don't understand what's happening. Sometimes I can remember another sister, one who looks just like Margaret. Other times, I'm certain there were only ever 4 of us children. Papa says we must never speak of this to anyone. March 28th. Mama has been crying all day. She keeps saying she's lost one of us, but we're all here. The police came tonight. I'm frightened. Rebecca looked up at Helen. "Did your grandfather ever explain what this meant?" Helen nodded slowly. "He told me, near the end of his life, that his family had a secret. His sister Margaret had been a twin, an identical twin named Mary. When the girls were babies, Mary died of scarlet fever. But Margaret, who was too young to remember her sister, began seeing Mary's reflection in mirrors. She would talk to her, play with her. The family convinced themselves it was just a child's imagination. But then, as Margaret got older, the whole family started seeing Mary in mirrors. They would glimpse her reflection, always watching, always present. It terrified them, but they couldn't explain it, couldn't make it stop. When they went to have the family portrait taken, they deliberately left an empty chair out of the frame. They didn't want Mary's reflection in the photograph. But she appeared anyway, Rebecca said softly. Yes, and when Mama saw the photograph, really saw it with that child staring out from the mirror, she finally broke down. She remembered Mary, remembered losing her, remembered that there should have been 5 children. The grief and the impossibility of what they were seeing destroyed her mind. Helen opened another envelope and pulled out a photograph. It showed 2 identical baby girls, perhaps 6 months old, lying on a blanket. On the back was written, "Margaret and Mary, May 1895. The city officials thought the family was insane, Helen continued. They separated the children, committed the parents, and destroyed any evidence of Mary's existence. They even erased her birth and death records. I've looked. It's as if she never existed at all." Rebecca thought of Catherine Donovan, imprisoned in a psychiatric hospital, knowing her daughter had lived and died, seeing her child's face in a photograph, but being told by everyone that she was delusional. "What happened to Margaret?" Rebecca asked. "She lived a long life, married, had children. But my grandfather said she never looked in mirrors again if she could help it, and she never, ever had her photograph taken." Rebecca returned to Providence with copies of all the documents Helen had shared. She created a comprehensive archive of the Donovan case, including the photograph, the glass plate negative, the police reports, Eleanor's diary entries, and the evidence of Mary Donovan's brief existence. She arranged for the mirror from Whitmore's studio to be donated to the Historical Society, where it was displayed with the Donovan family portrait and a plaque explaining their story. The exhibition opened on a cold March evening, exactly 121 years after the photograph was taken. Visitors stood before the mirror and the portrait, seeing the impossible reflection, understanding finally that the child in the mirror had been real. A daughter, a sister, a twin, whose existence had been erased by death and then by bureaucratic convenience. Catherine Donovan's descendants came to the opening. They stood together, looking at their ancestor's face in the photograph, seeing the fear and the knowledge in her eyes. After a century of silence, the truth was finally acknowledged. Mary Donovan had existed. She had been loved. She had been lost. And in one photograph, in one mirror's reflection, she had remained visible, waiting for someone to see her, to remember her, to bring her story back into the light. Rebecca stood in the gallery as visitors filed past, many stopping to stare at the mirror's reflection, whispering to each other about the child who shouldn't be there. She thought about how easily people could be erased from history, how convenient it was to label grief as madness, how much truth could be buried in the name of propriety and order. But she also thought about the power of evidence, of photographs and documents and persistent questions. The truth, she realized, had a way of surviving, even when it seemed impossible. Sometimes it took 121 years. Sometimes it took a historian willing to look closely at what everyone else had overlooked. Sometimes it took nothing more than enlarging a mirror's reflection and believing what you saw.